The challenge of continuing to use fossil fuels is enormous. We'll need to do it for the next 100 years, but we can't do it the way we're doing at the moment. We must capture as much of the CO2 that we produce from those fossil fuels and store it. The one major mechanism we've got of doing that is to compress it and transport it and store it into a variety of underground reservoirs.
If we're going to store carbon dioxide deep underground, we're talking about billions and billions of tonnes, we need to understand all the processes involved with doing that on an industrial scale. How does the carbon dioxide move underground? How can we ensure that it doesn't escape? What happens to it in the long term? All of these research questions are addressed as part of the Qatar Carbonates and Carbon Storage Research Centre, a 10-year, $70 million programme funded jointly by Qatar Petroleum, Shell and the Qatar Science and Technology Park.
At Shell, obviously, we're really concerned about the future of energy. About half of the world's oil yet to be developed is in those carbonate reservoirs in the Middle East. The use of this research in understanding CO2 and its storage underground in the carbonate reservoirs is really important to address climate change. Using this research to be able to enhance oil recovery from those reservoirs could make a very significant difference to the amount of energy produced.
The Qatar Carbonates and Carbon Storage Research Centre has employed some of the top young academics, PhD students and postdocs, and attracted them to London. So we have a big pool of expertise, but it's very broad. It ranges from geologists who go out to fieldwork, to geochemists who work in the lab, through to physical chemistry experts, through to computational fluid dynamics experts.
At QCC SLC, we have a multi-scale imaging laboratory that is unique in the world. We have pioneered methods where we can look inside the rock with X-rays to examine both the rock structure and the fluids within them at scales of a micron and upwards to core samples that may be up to a metre long.
We need to know if the kinds of chemical reactions that take place when you inject CO2 underground will affect the flow properties of that fluid, or will affect the integrity of the cap rock that's keeping that fluid safely in place. The main focus of our work is an area known as petrophysics, where we're trying to understand how carbon dioxide and brine flow through the rocks and how they react chemically with the rocks once that carbon dioxide is injected underground. We do that primarily through an experimental approach. We make observations of what happens when carbon dioxide is flowing through actual rocks at the conditions of pressure and temperature that we see in the subsurface. So this unique facility combines high pressure apparatus that allows us to perform those observations in real rock cores at reservoir conditions.
With my research group, we develop experimental techniques to study how CO2 behaves when it's injected into rock samples that are representative of deep geological storage formations. So these rocks are very heterogeneous, so they're very complex, they belong to a natural environment. Our goal specifically is to quantify and understand how these heterogeneities affect the way CO2 distributes and flow into the rocks. We inject a very small amount of radioactive tracer into the rock sample. By using a special technique, we're able to basically detect the movement of the tracer through the rock. And this allows us to quantify how well the CO2 is able to displace the water and to quantify how much CO2 is stored into the rock.
My group specifically looks inside rocks at very small scales, the pore scale, at the micron level, because that's the scale of the little gaps between the solid rock into which we're going to force the CO2 and we want to store it.
I use the micro-CT to do experiments on carbonate cores, and I look at the reaction between CO2 saturated brine, which is acidic, and carbonate rock. And I take three-dimensional tomographies dynamically, so over and over and over again, as we flood this reactive fluid through the rock, and I look at how the rock dissolves and what conditions it dissolves under and how it dissolves under different conditions.
We image the processes that would occur during CO2 storage. We look at what will happen in the long term to ensure safe storage, And we also develop numerical models.
We have two ways of disseminating our research, and that's through the academic method, where we go to conferences and present and publish papers, but we also want to package our data up into much more useful tools that help the industry be able to predict what's going on subsurface.
We're already working in Canada and the UK on small pilot scale activities, but if we're really going to address climate change, I think we're going to have to get massive scale, and this project will really help us make that understanding come alive.
By 2050, we've got to capture 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide a year to meet our requirements to keep the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere down below 450 parts per million. What we've got to do in order to do that is to utilise all the resources we've got to rapidly develop this technology.
The work that we do is allowing us to design safe and effective CO2 storage. If we achieve this, we will be able to move seamlessly and smoothly towards a secure energy future.